Hi, everyone. We are starting the first webinar series. Um, my name is Professor Dr. Saidur Rahman. It's my great pleasure to invite you all to our first webinar, Teaching with Purpose, a Credible Approach in the Classroom, organized by TESOL Bangladesh Association of Applied Linguists. As I understand, we all live in an independent time zone at this moment. For Bangladesh, a very good morning, Shubho Shakal. If you are in Sydney or other part of the world, very good morning. I know a little bit of Malaysia, it's possibly afternoon. Petang, Indonesia, Selamat Sore, good afternoon. Vietnam, our friends from India, Philippines. I am really excited to see 178 participants register for the first ever webinar organized by our association. We have 116 local participants. We have 62 international participants. Before I start, I'd like to share our journey as an association. We formed our association on 18 December 2014, almost 6 years ago. And very surprisingly, we started our association during a project by British Council where the participants from all over Bangladesh, mostly English teachers, we were discussing to have a platform where the young minds will get together and we can actually work something different from other associations. We wanted to have an association where everybody will be able to share their knowledge and their voices will be heard. At this moment, we have more than 2,000 members. Our members mostly are English teachers. However, we have a good number of BA honors and masters in English language students from different public and private universities. We envisage to make this platform of teachers an association that will be able to create impact on our society and our country. We have already got members from all over Bangladesh. In addition to that, as part of our collaboration, we plan to create link to international bodies very soon. Our mission is to create, link, develop, and support TESOL professionals in Bangladesh through providing different talks, training, webinars, conferences, publication, and by sharing knowledge. And as part of this initiative, Dr. Ahmar Mahboob is here today. Before I request Shams to introduce our speaker, I would like to just say a few words about Dr. Ahmar Mahboob. My association, Dr. Mahboob, started very recently when I was invited to be part of his Education in COVID-19 project. He has brilliant ideas and I really loved attending his session. I took part in some of the session with his young and dynamic students who are doing projects through credible approach. And I guess I'm still learning the credible approach from him. And a lot of things that he talked about, Subaltern Linguistics, Colonization 3, and he has been giving talk on Zoom platform ever since the COVID-19. And I requested him to share his idea with our Bangladeshi teachers. I'm so glad that Dr. Ahmar Mahboob have accepted our request. I request Shams to introduce the speakers for today. Shams.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Hello, everyone. My name is Shams. I'm currently doing my PhD in Learning Design and Technology at Purdue University in the United States. Before joining my PhD program, I was a faculty member at BRAC Institute of Languages. I'm really excited to have Dr. Ahmar Mahboob as the speaker for our inaugural webinar. I am personally very excited because I completed my Fulbright at Indiana University Bloomington, where Dr. Mahboob earned his PhD from. Though I now have joined Indiana University's rival university, Purdue, I still feel the connection. So those who do not know, Indiana University and Purdue University are great rivals, and this rivalry has going on for years. So my IU friends are not happy that I am at Purdue, and my Purdue friends are not happy that I was at IU. So in either way, I am the traitor. So I'm not sure what Dr. Mahboob feels being an IU alumnus, but it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Ahmar Mahboob. So Dr. Ahmar Mahboob is currently working as an associate professor at the Department of Linguistics at the University of Sydney. He earned his PhD at Indiana University Bloomington in 2003. Dr. Ahmar is keenly interested in the application of language sciences to developmental issues. His primary research interests are on an examination of policies, practices, and implications of language variation in local and global contexts. Dr. Ahmar has published extensively. He was the co-editor of TESOL Quarterly and the associate editor of Linguistics and the Human Sciences for several years. In 2019, Dr. Ahmar was named as Australia's Research Field Leader, English Language and Literature in the Australian's Research magazine. Dr. Ahmar has organized a number of regional, national, international conferences and is the convener and the co-creator of the Free Linguistics Conference. Recently, he has been conducting many workshops and giving talks online. Before I give the floor to Dr. Ahmar Mahboob, I want to remind you that please keep your audio and video switched off during the presentation. And after the end of the presentation, there will be a question answer session. One of our co-hosts will circulate a Google form link where you can post your questions, and our co-host will facilitate the discussion session after the end of the presentation. So Dr. Ahmar Mahboob, you are on.
Thank you so much, Shams. I absolutely have nothing against Purdue. In fact, when I was at IU, I had some fantastic mentors who were actually at Purdue.
Okay.
Indiana is not that big, including I had some fantastic mentors also at Indiana State University. So they're all connected and interlinked. And I think we should see them as, rather than seeing them as rivals, they're rivals in sports, yeah. But in, I think, in other ways, we should think of them as collaborative institutions. Just like I think we should see our own institutions the same way. We are not really competing with each other. We have the same goals. We have the same agenda, which is to essentially empower our communities and the people in our communities. So we can work much better collaboratively, yeah, rather than in competition. Thank you again for the introduction. Thank you also, Saeed Rahman Saab, for the invitation, and to TESOL Bangladesh for hosting this talk. As I've sort of said, I want to start off by sharing a poem with you. So let me share my screen, and then we will have a look. Okay, you should be able to see this, right? Okay, so the lovebirds of Pabna. If only I had stopped her from drinking. She did say that the water tasted funny, and it looked yellow and smelt of metal. Why didn't I stop her? Why didn't we fly away? Yes, it was hot and humid, and we were thirsty, but I should not have let her drink. The poison spitting vehicles, the sewage rivers, black belching factories, the plastic rivers, chemical plants, the garment dyes, coal power plants, and unidentified crimes. We knew what fed that water, and yet I let her drink. Where will I fly to now? With whom? I have known no love but Padma, and now she is gone. So, for many of you, especially for those of you who are from Bangladesh, I guess you will recognize a couple of names here. Pabna is, of course, a city and a region that Mona and I were lucky enough to visit and were hosted by some fabulous friends there. But at the same time, we were extremely depressed by what we saw, especially in terms of the river pollution, the poverty, the ways in which people lived, mostly in tin houses. Imagine a tin house has almost no insulation. So imagine neither for noise nor for heat or cold. So imagine living in those houses. And then we saw, factories, and we saw all the chemical plants on the way. We saw the traffic. We were stuck. It took us almost 8 hours to come back from Pabna to Dhaka. And as many of you would know, that's not actually unexpected. So, I wrote this poem as a response to being in Pabna. And you can also, some of you will recognize Padma right here at the bottom. That's another name. Of course, in this poem, it refers to the name of the spouse of the bird that is narrating this poem. But also, those of you familiar with Bangladesh would know that Padma is name of river Ganges once it enters Bangladesh, and also that Pabna is where the three big rivers meet. So, of course, historically, you can imagine that this is a very fertile plain. This is a plain with abundance of food and diversity of life. But when you go there, you see that the diversity of life is no longer there. You see on the streets timber logged from the forests, and you can sort of imagine what's going on around those things. And you see that around you is quite a bit of garbage. The streets are not very clean. There's lots of noise pollution. You cannot sleep in Dhaka, or Bangladesh. While we were there, that was one of the things that we felt really sad about, just the amount of noise pollution that there is. And and accompanying that noise pollution and the air pollution and the other pollution on land and in water, you also see how it has affected wildlife. One of the things that I observe, is how infrequently do you see wildlife or birds in Bangladesh, especially in Dhaka, but even in the countryside, in Pabna, there were hardly any birds. You also don't see a lot of old people, and you sort of start wondering what's going on. Why is it that, the real ground condition that we see and observe, with the poverty that we see, the problems that we see, this is very observable. I don't think I need to show any of you here any data to show how polluted some of these cities are. My own home country is exactly the same. It's no better, no worse. Just dirty and noisy. And you realize that, and you question, why is it that we keep educating our kids hoping for a better future, and yet our future is no better than what it was yesterday, and perhaps in many ways worse. And especially as teachers and educators, I think it's very important for us to sort of say, what is going on? What is going on that we spend so much energy and we have so much passion for what we do. We joined education, we became teachers not because we wanted to become millionaires, right? We became teachers because we have love for our people and our communities and our students and our children, and we want to make sure want to contribute to making sure that they can do the best and they live in the best world that they can. And yet at the same time, we realize that the world that we are living in is killing us. Slowly we are all dying. The acid water in parts of Bangladesh, especially in Pabna where I was, and when you open the tap and the water is yellow and stinky, and again, many of you will realize that and perhaps live in that condition. It's like I was just there for a few days and I was thinking, how is life for people who live like that every day? When you can't use water from the tap because it's poisoned, and if you use it, it's going to slowly kill you as well. And you see what's happening around, and you see even the birds are dying. And then what are we doing in education? We are training students so that they can get jobs for certain corporations or certain companies. But and so if because that is our goal, our whole education system is skewed towards producing students who can be employed by certain companies. Now, what we are doing, therefore, instead of educating our students to becoming independent and to be able to take care of themselves and the people around them, the environment around them, the wildlife around them, instead of being able to participate and become active citizens in their everyday aspect and contribute to the prosperity and the well-being of the community, we're not doing any of that. Instead of that, we're just training our students to get jobs. Now, if that is the goal of our education, if our goal of education is simply for our students to get jobs, then of course, all the other stuff is being missed out. Isn't that what our education should be really aimed at? Shouldn't our education lead to our students coming out and graduating so that they can contribute to their communities, so that they can, even during their student life, they should start contributing to cleaning up their environment, making sure that things are clean, making sure that, sort of the rivers and the water system is not being polluted, trying to help reduce poverty and dependence on money. Those are all things that we should be engaged in during our education, so that once we complete our education, we keep continuing to do that. And because we will keep continuing to do that, our communities will slowly prosper and improve and harmonize. So instead of the disharmony that you see around us, you will start seeing harmonization. Because the picture that you see behind me is the image that I use for part 3 of the essay, The Unmaking of Paradise, Literacy as Trojan Horse. This is an image of a world that we can move into if we start to develop our education for our own prosperity. Because you know why? This is not the world we are living in today. This is a world that we would like to live in. The world we live in today, I'll show you what that looks like. That looks like this. Everything is dying. Everything is dead. The color is gone. It's dull and gray, full of tar, noise, pollution. That's the world we are in. And that's not the world that we used to live in. We used to live in a beautiful world, something like this. This is the cover from part 1 of the same essay. This is the world that used to exist. Notice how colorful it is. Notice how the humans lived in huts which were made out of organic material. Have you noticed how rare it is to find archaeological remains in South Asia or other indigenous parts of the world? Yes, there are some. You will find some here and there from different times of human history, but you don't find a lot of them, and you don't find a lot of everyday houses of people. Why? Haven't you wondered why don't we have these archaeological remains? Well, the reason was because our ancestors used to make temporary houses using organic material, which was environmentally integrated. Why? Because they didn't always live in the same place the whole time. They moved seasonally. Why? Because in different seasons, different parts of the geography where people live are better suited for and has better climate. So people move around, right? And that's how you will find, even in today, you will find indigenous communities in different parts of the world. They still do the same. They migrate, they move around. Why? Because climatically where they live, the climate requires them to move, because there is in different weathers, in different seasons, different places are better to be in, right? And therefore they use temporary housing. They didn't have land ownership. In fact, in South Asia, all of our countries there, we did not have land ownership. The concept of land ownership did not exist. It was introduced during the colonial era, during the British, after the British had invaded. Now, notice how before our indigenous era and now how things have changed. And notice from there, colonization and continuous suppression, which hasn't ended. That's why I call it colonization 3.0, because it hasn't ended. The continued sociosemiotic violence. Now, what is sociosemiotics? Sociosemiotic is anything that is not material. So you can think about it this way. There are certain things in the world that are material, right? So for example, the glass that I'm holding that you see here, right? Now, this is material. Now, some of you might have noticed that before I started reading the poem, I actually had a sip of water, just like I am having now. Now, the fact that you observed me having a sip of water was a material act that you observed. I was doing something in place and time that you observed me doing, right? Now, if I ask you, why do you think I did this? Why do you think I had a sip of water before I read the poem? You may have a lot of answers if I ask you to interpret that action. But notice that your interpretation of that action is not the action. It is an interpretation of the action. So the only thing that actually happens is the act. The act is that I had a sip of water. Anything else which is not the act is in our minds. Our beliefs, our interpretations will be based on our own experiences and our own ways of looking at things, right? We will have different ways of looking at it. We will have different interpretations. So notice how in all of a sudden you can move from the material, which is the act, to the non-material, which are the thoughts around that act. That's the distinction. The act is material because it happens in time. And anything else that is not the act is the non-material, which means it is socio-semiotic. Socio-semiotic means it's socially constructed. And its semiotics means that it meaning making. It makes meanings for us. How do we make meanings in life? Notice, as a human being, we make meanings through our 5 sensory systems. Now, we should acknowledge right away that not all human beings have access to 5 sensory systems, and that not all human beings use the 5 sensory systems in the same way. And therefore, of course, everybody's world is very different. So what are these 5 sensory systems? You've all heard about them, right? The first one is sight. The second one is sound. The third one is smell. The fourth one is touch. And the fifth one is taste. Now, it is in this particular order that I want to state them. This is a very important order, and I'll explain this to you. So the first is sight, then sound. Then after that, you've got, so sight and sound I call group A, and I'll explain this to you why in a second. And then there's group B, which is smell, touch, and then taste, in that order. That's group B. Now, why these groups? I'll tell you the difference. Now, the difference between group A and group B is that for things to happen in group A, you have to be physically, to happen in group B, for things to happen in group B, you have to be physically present. Right? So for example, to be able to touch something, to taste something, to smell something, you have to be there. I can say to you something. I can say, for example, imagine the smell of a bouquet of rose. Now that might induce a particular smell, but you're not smelling it, right? You can only smell it in the moment. Now that's specifically about that has to be true for group B. Now in group A, that may be true, but it's also possible that you can move away from the here and now. So you can talk, for example, through looking at art, through looking at images, through watching videos, which combine visual and sound. So sight and sound, combine the two, or through writing, or through listening to stories, you can actually move away from the present and move into an imaginative world, or into a socio-semiotic world, into a theoretical world, or whatever it is. But you move away from the present. Now that can only happen through group A, not through group B. Okay. Now that's a very important distinction to make. Why? Because it tells us how reality can be construed for us in different ways. So notice there is a material reality, which is things that are observable to you in the present, or through various ways. So for example, what you are seeing right now, what you are hearing right now, what you can touch, what you can smell, or what you can touch, or what you can taste. These are all things that you're experiencing at the moment. And notice this is different for each one of us. So even though we are in the same conversation at in a sense at this point in time. We're all listening to or engaged with the same sort of thoughts that are, but everybody is experiencing them differently. And where you are, what you're seeing is different from what I'm seeing. So even though we're sharing this sound, and you can actually see me, and I can see some of you, or I can see your pictures, but you don't actually see what I can see, right? Now notice that. That's so interesting, because notice how sight here is a split. Sight is where we are, and sight is somewhere where we're not. The same thing is happening with sound at the moment. You can hear me, but you can probably also hear other things. So if I'm quiet for just a second, I'll be quiet for 5 seconds. Just listen to things that are around you. Take off your earplug and listen to things around you. Right? There's so many more sounds happening, which are happening in the present, and that tell you a lot, right? So the fact that I'm not bothered is because there is no sound that is out of the ordinary. So even though I'm talking to you and you're listening to me, your ears are still listening to other things. And if there is a loud noise, or for example something falls, for example in the kitchen or the other room, you will know right away, what happened. You will look what happened, because something is out of the ordinary. So notice how the sound in the present can bring you back into the present and into where you are, rather than in a different world, which I'm taking you into, especially with the images that I'm showing you. I'm creating another world, another sense of reality, and taking you into that reality. So whereas through my talk, I'm trying to take you away from where you are, what you hear in the present keeps you located as well. And notice that can only happen with group A. It does not happen with group B. So why is that important? Because it has implications for education and for literacy. Now notice how in education, so much of everything is focused around a couple of goals. Goal number one, literacy. That everything has a focus on literacy. Notice how even, for example, UNESCO and other world indices use literacy as a major measure of the development of a country or of a group of people. So literacy becomes a measure of how able a person is or is not. Now, this is extremely problematic. Notice, even though the international organizations keep pushing for it, including UNESCO, these are highly problematic. Why? Because notice, literacy is something that is visual, right? It operates through the visual system. Right now, you're engaged with me, but you're also engaged with the visual system and the audio system. So you can see me and you can hear me. But notice, reading and writing is also visual. It is not oral, but it's a different kind of a visual. It takes you into a different place. And so, for example, if I were to change my, I don't have, do I? Yeah, yeah. So imagine we have the capability of taking you away through a symbolic system from the area place you are, through the use of these symbols, through the use of visual symbols and oral symbols. So notice then that those two are the two most important tools in our ability to influence somebody else. So if you want to influence somebody else, you can do that most easily and most remotely. You can reach the largest number of people through the visual, right? Especially imagine oral recordings, or for example, a recording of this talk, which may be shared on YouTube or Facebook, was not possible 100 years ago or 200 years ago, right? Or even 10, 15 years ago. These technologies are new. So if you look at it historically and you move yourself back 200 years in time, and you think about how these things would have worked, you would start realizing that perhaps education was not dependent on literacy. Why? Because literacy is visual. Not everything needs to be visual. You can learn and understand things orally. So for example, a lot of indigenous communities, including in South Asia, the main form of education was not formal education or through school systems or through madrasas. Those who didn't exist. In fact, madrasas for early childhood education is un-Islamic. And I'll explain that to you in a second, right? So how did that education work? Essentially, education worked through models of apprenticeship. Kids were attracted to different things. They had different interests. And through looking at people do their work, observing them, asking questions, mirroring them, copying them, imitating them, getting feedback, practicing, you learn your trade, right? So for example, we call that ustad, right? Somebody who's an expert. So to become a teacher, you have to be an ustad because you have to be an expert yourself. It is once you become an expert that you become a teacher and you teach others. So notice our form of education was where you had to be an expert in order to be a teacher. Teaching was not about literacy or learning how to read and write. Becoming a teacher did not mean that you got an educational qualification, you had a B.Ed degree or had a qualification in education from some university, where you had to read X, Y, and Z theories. Most likely those theories were written and developed in the West. So not based on our context, right? And those are the teachers. So notice our teachers are no longer experts. They are not necessarily people who do things, but rather who have achieved literacy and have demonstrated an had literacy by achieving certain literacy goals, which are essentially certain types of degrees, which are all hierarchical, and being able to show that they have achieved a certain level of literacy. They are then given access to certain jobs and certain things. So literacy then becomes a way in which you get jobs. That's why education requires literacy, because literacy leads you to jobs. But notice, that's all true. That might be the case. But literacy is not about development or expertise. You can have expertise without literacy. So for example, again, thinking about the ustad, we've lost this tradition in many cases across South Asia, but in some instances, we still find them. For example, it's very common to find it in music. You still have ustad in music, right? So for example, a ustad of sitar would be a master player themselves, right? You cannot be a ustad without being a master player, right? So you become a master player, and then you're the ustad, and you train others, and then they learn from you, and then in time, some of them may become ustad in themselves, but not everybody will. You're right, because you have to have that expertise yourself before others become, you can train others. So notice the whole focus was on expertise, not literacy. And expertise, for example, in the context of music and ustad, they have very high literacy about music. They have very sophisticated knowledge about different rag and different tunes and different instruments and different things. I mean, perhaps I wouldn't have that terminology. I wouldn't be able to understand a conversation that two master musicians from South Asia have in Boli. So even though I can have a conversation with them in Boli about other things, when they will talk about music and their profession, I may not be able to understand them. Why? Because they're talking about it in very specialized terms. Why? Because they have a specialized terminology for music in their own Boli. Why? Because that's how languages evolve. That's a natural thing for Boli to do. They develop, Boli evolves and develops sophisticated and more advanced sort of I shouldn't use the word advanced. I should probably more specialized terminologies and appropriate grammatical sort of patterns to convey those meanings, because they need to do that. There's a need in order to do it, and therefore the language responds by adapting to that need. And that's just how languages evolve naturally. That's just a natural pattern for languages to evolve. So all languages evolve that way. Now, when we talk about the term language, and actually before I talk about language, I'm going to pause here and just see and ask my hosts if there are any specific questions that I might want to address at this time before I move on.
Ahmar Mahboob, what we are doing is we are collecting all the questions, so that will be handed over to you during a separate question and answer session. We are writing it down.
All right, fantastic.
We are recording it.
All right, fantastic. If there is something that you would like me to address, if you think it's relevant at the point in time I'm talking, do let me know, or just post, share it in the chat, and I will pick it up from there.
Okay, no problem.
Okay, I'm going to bring us back to this image because it's the last one is really depressing, and I don't want us to stay there very long. I want us to move here in a beautiful world. This is not like the past, of course. We have lost what we have lost, but we can envision a future which is still beautiful, even though it's not like it was before. You know, where we have regained our harmony with nature and the environment, and the colors are returning. And that is a world that I would like us to think about and move to. And clearly, our education is failing us because it's not doing that. Why? One, because, as I said, the focus is on literacy. And as I said, literacy is something that is visual, and it's not necessarily the case that knowledge or knowledge or science is dependent on literacy. You can have knowledge and science which is purely oral, and it's very sophisticated for the purposes for which it is used, and in the region and the context where it is used. So that's one. The second issue here is that the goal of education, as it is largely conceived, if you've observed this, is knowledge. We keep seeking knowledge. Knowledge is the goal. Imagine from the childhood, we are taught read, 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 so that your knowledge is bigger, you have wider knowledge, you have wider knowledge. Our education is focused on knowledge. Even our PhDs are focused on knowledge construction, right? The goal, how do you set up a PhD? Through a literature review. What is a typical literature review? It's about finding a gap in the literature, which means you're finding a gap in knowledge. And then the purpose of it is your PhD is to address the gap in the literature review. So you're trying to address the gap in the knowledge. So essentially, your purpose of education, whether from the early childhood all the way to PhD, in the way that it is practiced in most developing and poor and exploited countries, is where we see that the purpose is everybody is trying to seek knowledge. Knowledge becomes the goal, right? Not unlike unfortunately, a bad sort of a comparison, but actually, it's a very relevant comparison as well. It's kind of like money. Our societies, people are chasing money. Money is the goal. Knowledge is goal, right? These things become goals for us. Now, notice what if you want to think about it, categorically, if we want to create categories of things, and we want to sort of try to do some sort of linguistic application on understanding the world around us, then one of the things we can do is we can try to see, are there certain ways or certain categories in which we can see that terms like money and knowledge are different from words like, for example, water and land and trees and biodiversity and water quality, right? Is there a difference between these two things? And you realize that actually there is. There are certain things in the world, and certain categories of things in the world, and that are infinite. And there's another category of things and entities in the world and category of things in the world that are finite. So there's a finite category and there's an infinite category. Now notice that things like knowledge, money, power, these things are infinite, right? There is no limit to knowledge. There is no limit to money. Now, if you turn something that is in the category of infinite into your goal, so for example, knowledge becomes our goal as it has become in the current sort of dominant educational paradigms, then if that becomes your goal, then notice that you've set yourself up for failure. Why? Because you've set yourself a goal which is infinite. It has an infinite category. It's a goal that can never be achieved. Why? Because it's infinite. You can never achieve all the knowledge. It's not possible. Why? It's just not theoretically possible. Why? Because it's an infinite category. It's part of an infinite category. It doesn't end. You can't have all of it. The same thing with money. So imagine if you set your goal to be something that is in the infinite category, then you are chasing a goal that will never be achieved. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how many PhD dissertations you write. It doesn't matter how many books you read. Doesn't matter how much you read and learn. You will never learn everything. There's more. But guess what? While you're reading all of that, while you're learning all of that, guess what is happening? The world around you in the present is crumbling. So while our attention is diverted into a future, into possibilities, into theories, into discussions, into appraisals and evaluations and judgments and arguments and discussions and disagreements, all of that's happening, which is all discursive, which means it's non-material. While all that is happening, what is happening in the material world? We see the dark side of things. And we see that this picture that you see behind me is not where we live today. It's where we want to live. In a sense, I asked these images, all three of them, are drawn actually by my daughter. And I asked her to draw them for me because I wanted a young person and a young person's imagination to paint these. So as I wrote these essays, each part I gave these essays to her. I read them with her. I discussed them with her, and then she did the artwork for part 1, part 2, and part 3, as I wrote each one of them, to reflect the meanings of the essay itself. And the third one is extremely important, and that's why I keep using it. Is because it's a world of in the future. Then notice it's not taking us back; it's taking us forward. Reharmonizing things. Now, how do you do that? How do you reharmonize yourself? What you do is you shift your focus from something that is infinite and move it into the finite. Look around you. See the nature of the world that we live in and the problems that you see around you. Address those problems, no matter what it is. Use your own subject area as well as go to beyond your disciplines. Become interdisciplinary. Remember, disciplines mean nothing. The world is not carved out in terms of disciplines. Our life is not split into sociology and anthropology and linguistics and psychology and biology and things. No, we live our life together. We're embedded. We are real. We speak. We think. We have feelings. We have relationships. We have thoughts. All of that, right? All of it is together. So the disciplinary boundaries mean nothing really. In fact, that is one of the reasons why we are unable to do things well, because we get tied down too much within disciplines. These disciplines are artificial constructs that we have inherited and we mirror based on Western universities. So the only reasons some of the departments exist in our universities are because universities in Western countries have those departments. We have never really thought about what an indigenous university will look like. What is it that we need? How does an indigenous perspective of the world look like? And you will realize, as soon as you start thinking of it, is that indigenous perspectives and knowledge structures and ways of making knowledge are holistic, are based on observation, are based on practice, and are based in the here and now. Why? Because that's where things can be changed and where things can become better. Now, notice again, taking you back to that water drinking, and I also use this as an excuse to have a sip. So, taking us back to that. Now, notice that you saw me have a sip of water multiple times. Now, I took an action in a point in time where I could take action. Now, if I were to try to undo the action, like I can't do that, right? I cannot undrink the water. Notice even grammatically, it's weird. It's not easy for me to even say that. I want to undrink the water. How can you undrink water? I can't do it. Notice even the grammar doesn't allow me. Why? Because it's not a human experience. So the grammar is not developed, or grammar is not evolved in order to sort of reflect that thought. So I'm finding it hard to even say it. And therefore, and of course, I cannot do it. And you know I cannot do it. If I were to say, undo an action that you did 2 hours ago, you cannot undo it, right? If I were to say, unsay the things that you have said to somebody which offended somebody, even though you know that, yeah, I should not have said it and it offended the person, you cannot unsay it. Why? Because you can only act in the present. You cannot act in the non-present. And that's extremely important. Now, if education takes us away from the present, then it makes us unable to act. And if it makes us unable to act, then the world that we live in today will not change because we are not changing it. Now, let me share another poem that I wrote recently with you, and then I will move into the credible approach because it will tell us into how to sort of do this. This poem is called Beautiful Tomorrow. Let me share the screen with you. Beautiful tomorrow. In the desolation of today, I hang on to the promises of tomorrow, when life will be in harmony and struggles gone. I believe that things will change and I will fly again over the rainbows, looking down at forests and rivers, spotting wildlife as they enjoy their day. Waiting for tomorrow, I watch videos and nature and read books about wildlife. I imagine the future and think of stuff to take along. And then I remember yesterday and today, where we pump more oil and burn more coal, cut more forests and mine more gold. And then I wonder how tomorrow will be. How will tomorrow be if today we kill each other and nature too? We build more weapons and borders too. Will tomorrow be beautiful if today we neglect? So you see, the message in this poem is pretty clear. You know, time to act is now, in the present where we are. You know, the later we move in, the more we procrastinate, essentially things will stay the same. So the question is then, if we want to take action, if we want to act, one of the limitations currently is that we don't have a lot of models. We don't actually have a lot of examples and ways of thinking which we can sort of build on to do this kind of work. Because, you know, we need models. We all need models. We need examples, and we need to do things so that we can sort of imagine and do things which can shift our practices. You know, we all have the desire to make a change, but then often we are, you know, stuck in terms of how do we do it. You know, and to try to address that concern, we go into looking at research. We engage in research. We want to do a PhD, but unfortunately, notice because our PhDs are stuck in knowledge, the goal is not knowledge. It's not infinite. It is not finite. Therefore, that we don't achieve anything. So instead of making our goals something that is in the infinite category, I suggest we make things that are in the finite category our goals. So for example, to clean up the neighborhoods that we live in. Today, I will use an example of something that I observed in Bangladesh. It's also very true in Pakistan. It's also very true in the Philippines. In fact, it's very true in a lot of the exploited communities around the world. And this issue that I will tackle with you, and I would encourage us to all to work on together as we talk about the credible approach today, is diabetes. Is diabetes in our communities. You know, I don't think it would be a surprise if I say that, you know, if I ask people here, hey, does anybody know at least one person who has diabetes in this group? Guess what? I would be surprised if all of you would say yes, at least one, maybe more. Maybe you are pre-diabetic or diabetic yourself, right? So we know that this is a major concern in our communities. This is a concern that we all have. We know that it's a concern, and this is something I would say that we can tackle as educators, yeah, and language teachers through the kind of work that we do in our classrooms, the kind of research that we do. We can actually address that. So notice now, our goal has now shifted. Our goal is not knowledge. Our goal is shifting from knowledge into sort of saying, hey, you know what? I'm going to try to do something through my work in academia and education, as a teacher, as a student, as a researcher, as a human being in living. I want to do something about this. I want to figure out what's going on, and I want to see if I can do something. Now, as you start doing this research into diabetes, and especially type 2 diabetes, and the causes of type 2 diabetes, you will start it won't take you very long before you start realizing that one of the major determiners of type 2 diabetes is the amount of sugar consumed during childhood, and especially early childhood. The amount of sugar that you consume in your early childhood impacts both diabetes, but also impacts your dental health. And dental health is in childhood is unfortunately is an indicator also of life expectancy. So these things you will start realizing, and you will start realizing that the problem here is sugar consumption. And that sugar consumption leads to multiple problems. It leads to diabetes, type 2 diabetes, which is so common around us. We know that it's actually increasing everywhere that we see. It's a huge problem. Obesity and diabetes type 2 are major concerns. We are also seeing that, kids and people have really bad teeth. We are also seeing that in our parts of the world, exploited communities, people's life expectancy is relatively low. And in many cases, our life expectancy is decreasing, which is, again, not surprising. Look at people's teeth, and it will tell you, they've got problems. And a lot of that goes back to sugar. So sugar is actually a poison, especially when it comes to children. It's also a poison when it comes to cognitive development and children's ability to perform tasks and engage in things and to be able to think. Sugar affects their ability to think. So sugar is a poison. Sugar is a poison, but we just look around you, how much sugar is consumed in our communities and by people around us, including children. I've seen families and people in so many parts of the world where I've seen parents and actually adding sugar to milk and giving it to their infants, and who are 1 year old, 2 year old. So sugar is introduced very early on. Soda, candies, all chocolates, sugary things, all these things are all around you. You just see how huge numbers of it being consumed, especially by kids. Now, these kids, when they consume so much sugar, guess what's going to happen? When they grow older, they are most likely going to have type 2 diabetes. If you want to stop type 2 diabetes later on in these kids, you have to have to drastically reduce, if not stop, all sugar consumption in the children today. If you help them stop sugar consumption today, then when these kids grow older, they may not have type 2 diabetes. Right? Now, notice this is a long-term thing. But if you don't do it now, and if the children keep consuming sugar at the levels that they do today, then this problem is not going to go away. So what does it tell us? It tells us that this is a real-world problem that we experience in our communities. And I want us to all to think about, how do we address this in our own capacities as teachers, as researchers, as language educators? And that's where I find it useful to think about it, work not in terms of research papers and research projects or achieving knowledge, but action, projects, doing things, engagement, action. Why? Because action is taken in the moment. It's an act that is done. And an act that is done is an act that has a potential to change, because it is an act. It is material, as opposed to being purely non-material, where you're sitting there thinking. reading about nature, reading about watching documentaries, reading books, thinking about what you want to do or not do, or what to take or not take, right? That's where we're spending our time at the moment, not acting. So we need to move that into the action. So we need to create activities, we need to create projects where we can involve our students in projects where the end goal will be to create sugar literacy, for create campaigns, working with our students to create campaigns where the children will make material to, to make others become aware of the dangers of sugar. And through that, hopefully, because the children are engaged in developing the material, they're engaged in developing activities, doing things, hopefully through doing that, their understanding will also become more than just theoretical. So trying to create a change in our communities in terms of sugar consumption by turning sugar into a focused set of activities where the goal of our activities, what the students will be actively engaged in, the goal of it is to change their behavior and attitudes towards sugar. Now, in order to do this, of course, you still use literacy. In fact, you can do multiple types of literacies. You're no longer dependent just on peer-reviewed papers in X discipline. You can look across disciplines. You can look at non-peer-reviewed material. You can look at oral histories and oral culture literature. You can look at understandings and discussions in multiple languages in different modalities. All of that is open up to you. Why? Because you've shifted. You're no longer the slave of knowledge, goal of knowledge, but rather you're focused on trying to address an issue. Therefore, to address an issue, you realize, that you can't be dependent on just one thing, right? So if I ask you to plan something, you can't just do it based on a theoretical outline. You will have to think about it in all different perspectives. You'll have to do things, right? And doing things means you will have to consolidate and consider all these different variables and factors. And it's the same thing. So getting students to do things, getting them to engage in activities, engages them and makes them do things. And through doing things, you're able to actually understand things in a different way. And so the credible approach that I will talk about next is essentially a way of achieving that. And credible is essentially an acronym. Now, let me share my screen again with you guys, with all of you here. Here you go. Now, this is from an art essay, this a set of art things that I'm still working on. It's available, the draft is available on academia. It's called Credible Research and Positive Discourse Analysis. Let me sort of walk you through some of this stuff. So essentially, credible is an acronym. And you can notice I've said credible project or research. Essentially, in terms of project, it's applicable and relevant to educational sort of contexts. So essentially thinking about it in terms of how do we create, instead of thinking of the syllabus in terms of topics and grammatical points, you think about it in terms of activities and what goals do you want the students to achieve. And the grammar and the readings and everything else sort of fits into it, because the literacy becomes a tool. Literacy is no longer a goal. So when literacy becomes a tool, what you're teaching your students to do is to be able to learn how to find the right knowledge, find the right resources, and use those resources in order to achieve their goals. If they have this skill and if they have this ability, then they can find the knowledge for anything that they're trying to do. And that ability is what's going to help them. Why? Because nobody can have all the knowledge, right? So skills and abilities take you much further than trying to chase an infinite goal. So credible projects are thinking in terms about locally embedded projects which are contextually relevant, so they're locally oriented. They respond to practical needs. They're not driven by gaps or theory. It engages the stakeholders. So we're not just collecting data, right? It's not like you've got research participants or survey participants. No, how can you actually create knowledge or create change if all you're doing is collecting data from people who are not really even interested in what you're doing and may not even interpret the questions in the way you're asking them. It's useless, that all that lit research that we produce. And that's why you don't see any application of the research we are doing in your communities, right? Imagine all the PhDs and all the people who are being educated in our schools and colleges and universities in our countries and regions, all of the thousands and hundreds and thousands of graduates. Notice nothing changes on the ground. All these PhDs are writing papers and publishing and writing books and doing all these things, and yet nothing changes. So notice, why are we spending so many human hours and resources but achieving nothing? That's what we need to change, right? So if we change our ways to doing education, we can change the way that people engage with knowledge and what people do with knowledge and how people use education. Now, credible is one way of doing it. Why? Because we're engaging with stakeholders. We're not just using them as data sources. And in doing this, we're drawing on understandings of both local knowledge and practices. Very important. We need to understand the local. And at the same time, we need to be informed by diverse approaches and experiences. Notice, this is not just Western. We want to learn from each other, not just the West. In fact, in many ways, what happens in the West is totally irrelevant to us. Pakistan and Philippines and Bangladesh are more similar to each other than any of these countries is to Australia or to the US. There's just huge differences between them and us, and there are many more similarities between each other. So we need to learn from each other, and especially look at good scenarios, look at good examples, look at success stories from wherever they are. Why? Because success stories tell us why certain things can work, or how certain things can work in certain sort of situations. And we want to learn from that because we want to apply that learning in our own contexts. And I'll talk about this again in a second. Now, doing all of this, why are we doing all of it? Because we want to benefit local communities. Because without benefit, there is little credibility of a project. Why are we doing it if it's not going to benefit the community? And it's not going to harm anybody else. Very important. Do not harm anybody or anything else. It doesn't matter if it's living things or non-living things. You have to be environmentally conscious, because remember, our elders and our ancestors were environmentally ethical. They were environmentally responsible. They did not harm nature. They did not harm other living and non-living things just because they could. And we need to remember that and take that heritage and our inheritance very seriously, because as we develop this work, we need to remember we want to benefit our communities and make sure we're not harming anybody. And this is especially the case in any work that we do towards decolonizing education, because as I will talk again, one of the key things and the key requirements in this work is what we call imandari, honesty, integrity, right? And it's also relates to ethics. So as imandari is crucial in the work we do, and in imandari can only happen if we are trying to bring benefits to people and we are not harming anybody. And remember, imandari, the notion of imandari means that you don't harm anybody else. Absolutely no harm to others, right? So, and it doesn't matter who the other is. So it doesn't matter if the other is X religion or Y religion or A race or B race or this ethnicity or that ethnicity, or speaks this language or that language, or has this accent or that accent, or speaks acts like this or that, and drinks this or that, or eats this and that. It makes absolutely no difference, because if you mistreat that person, whoever that person is, you're actually breaking your own imandari. And if you break your imandari, it's your imandari that is broken, right? And therefore, it's your ethical position that is compromised. It's your integrity that is compromised. So if you keep that in mind, if you keep your integrity and imandari as in mind, then essentially questions of discrimination disappear, because you cannot discriminate, because discrimination means and implies unethical behavior on your own part, which means any sectarian, religious, language-based, race-based, any kind of discrimination is essentially unethical, and because it violates the principle of imandari. And that's very important for us to remember. And that's really what I mean by ethical. And you know what? If you're going to do all this and you're going to bring benefit to a local community in your context, addressing a need in your community, guess what? You're the only one doing it, right? And so in a sense, by doing that practice and creating that practice, you're creating another positive example so that others can learn from your work, and they can also do it in their own context. And that's really what Credible is all about. Now, how do we actually do credible projects? If you go down this essay further, you will find a discussion on PDA. I will talk about PDA later. But there's a practical guide on sort of how to do it. So it's sort of the first aspect is the conceptual, right? How do we conceptually understand and develop this work? So instead of starting from theory or identifying a gap in the literature, we don't do that stuff. We're not interested in that stuff because our goal is not knowledge. We're trying to work with our real life situations. So what we start with, we identify an issue in your local context that you would like to focus on. Now for us, jointly in this group here, I would all like to work on and focus on sugar. Okay? So sugar, diabetes is an issue, and that's high rates of diabetes type 2, dental problems, and other sugar-related problems are a concern for us in our communities, and that is an issue that is very much local in where we live and where we are part of, and therefore we would like to create and focus something and do something about it. So the next thing I want you to do is work together and talk to your friends and colleagues and students and families. Talk about it, discuss it, because you need to think about topics and from multiple perspectives, listen to what they have to say, listen to their experiences, read things from different sources, involve people in your project, make it a community project, a class project, a group project, a project that's between teachers across disciplines. Because remember, the topic that we're dealing with is very soon we will realize it's interdisciplinary. We have got literacy, of course, people will be reading and writing and doing things. But of course, with sugar, we have science, we can go into mathematics, we can go into history, we can go into any subject by focusing on sugar and different aspects of sugar. So we notice that how we're trying to combine we can combine the various aspects of what we see as different disciplines or different subject areas by focusing on an issue. Because now we're realizing that all of those things, to address this issue of high sugar consumption, we can't just do it in our language classrooms. We actually have to work across the disciplines. All the teachers and the community have to work together to address this concern. Why? Because it's a community concern. You get people working with you, involve people. Notice this is all conceptual because this is setting up your ideas. Now, as you're doing this, you're also collecting data, but notice the data is no longer survey data, right? You're learning to identify things that people have already done to address this issue. You're looking for examples of what people have done. This is what I would call for us, for our approach, for a credible approach, this is the new way of doing literature review. So you're not focused on literature by looking at reference materials and it's getting stuck in journals which are behind paid walls and you can't access and you've got all these problems. No. Instead, you're looking at how did people have other people tried to address this sugar consumption because it's a global issue. I'm sure other people in other countries and other communities might have done it. I wonder how they have done it. What have they done? What have other people talked about it? And then you start exploring that. And you go to all different sources, locally, regionally, globally, multiple languages, it doesn't matter, newspapers, magazines, blogs, social medias, anything. It makes no difference. Because you're no longer tied to academic discourses and producing mirrors and silos, right? You read and you reproduce what you've read instead of thinking and applying and creating. So notice what we are doing is trying to move away from the traditional approach into a credible approach where we're trying to address concerns that people in our communities have. Right, so we're extending our notion of a literature review and we're changing the notion of data collection and we're turning this all into data, right? Identifying examples of successful projects and campaigns that have achieved goals similar to the ones you want to achieve. Identify various things. Notice it's things, it's not only texts or research papers, it's things. Anything can be a thing, right? We're opening up the space. We're opening up the possibility of people doing research who don't necessarily have to be very highly educated, because we're opening up research as making it accessible to people, right? Instead of making research inaccessible and technical and pretty useless, we are bringing research into the homes and to the lives of our daily existence by realizing how research is about action, about understanding and trying to address, and how everybody can do it. And we can do it in different ways. And we don't always have to be dependent on knowledge and English, but we can look at other things and learn from things. Things like advertisements, activities, books, policies, all of that stuff, products, posters, right? We learn from these things. And then we analyze it. Once, especially with examples of successful projects, once we have identified successful projects and campaigns, we want to do a discourse analysis of them. But notice, we want to do a positive discourse analysis. Now, notice this is in contrast with most of you have heard of critical discourse analysis, or CDA. You know, PDA, or positive discourse analysis, is a complementary approach. What does that mean? So to understand this a bit better, think about what critical discourse analysis does. Critical discourse analysis looks at texts or problems in the society or the community, or texts that have a problem, or bad examples, or bad messages, or bad newspapers edited, or problematic texts, and analyze why these texts are problematic. So we learn to analyze and identify why things are bad. But notice, we only learn how to identify what things are bad. We never go to the next stage. That is, how do we make things better? So instead of focusing on how to make things better, CDA leaves us by with the analysis of bad things and why things are bad. In many ways, I feel that's leaving us really frustrated. I mean, for years, until I sort of started doing the kind of work I do, it's extremely frustrating, because you know what the problems are. You can see them through your CDA. You can see them through your research. These are the problems. And yet, nothing happens. Nothing changes. So the research is not doing anything. So essentially what I suggest, I've essentially worked on developing work by some of my colleagues, especially Jim Martin and others, on positive discourse analysis, which is sort of comes out of SFL and linguistics, but then expanded it and made it more sociosemiotic and more sort of in terms of sensory systems instead of language based. So I call it the broad positive discourse analysis. So positive discourse analysis can be broad or narrow. Narrow I call more linguistic sort of positive discourse analysis, and broad positive discourse analysis takes a much more socio-semiotic approach, which means we take the 5 sensory systems as the way to enter into understanding what things happen. And there is a particular form that we use to do this, and I'll share this form with you. And also because this form we use both for analyzing things, and then we can inverse the form, and then we can use the inversed form for designing things. So it's a multi-purpose form, and I'll explain this to you in a second. Then we are doing, after that, we have done and analyzed things. So we look at the good examples. So instead of looking at bad examples, we look at good examples, because we want to learn how good things work, and we want to apply that to our own design. And so therefore, once we have done the analysis, we use that analysis to design our material. Notice our goal in the is no longer discussion. We are relating our findings to other theory and extending theory, but rather we are applying our analysis to creating things, to doing things. So our goal is to do things. So notice here, of course, in doing things, we're still reading, we're still learning, we're still collecting data, we're still analyzing, we're still coding, we're doing all that stuff. But our goal is not a documentation of our findings of our analysis of data, but our goal is to actually design and implement the project. And the theoretical work that we do is a stepping stone. So the theory we do is a stepping stone towards the action. So the credible approach is action. It takes you into action, because it is based in practice, in the material, in the here and now. Okay. And so you have to design your material based on your analysis. And then you actually implement your project. And through the whole process, document what you're doing. And once you've done this, share your project. That becomes your final research paper or research project report. That is what you publish. So you still notice we're still publishing, we're still writing, we're still contributing to the knowledge thing, but it's based on actual practice. It is not, it's based on action. It's based on practice. Our theorization, our analysis, our discussions are based on practice. They are not based just on thinking and talking and discourse. It's not just based on purely sociosemiotics and purely non-material. No, it is based on material action, which of course is interlinked with and thought about and discussed and referenced in relation to the knowledge structures, because knowledge is the resource, right? Knowledge is a resource we used in order to achieve a goal. And imagine if we all sort of do this project, right? We are going to create so many projects. We're going to have so many students and people create this anti-sugar campaign material. It will go out to hundreds and thousands of people. And perhaps if we keep doing it, repeating it, updating it, keep doing it again and again with these different groups of students over the years, then perhaps even though our governments are not doing anything, our health ministry is not doing anything, we as teachers, language teachers, working collaboratively with other teachers can do something and should do something, because it is our responsibility. Our responsibility as a teacher is not to just give them literacy so that our students become slaves to own, corporate owners and company owners and industry owners. No, we want our students to be independent, have self-respect, and be able to stand up for their own rights and have their own voice and be able to protect themselves and take care of themselves and the people around them, the community around them, the wildlife around them, the nature around them. That's what we want them to do. Now, if we want to do that, if that's our goal, and if we try to achieve that goal, then we have to act. It's not about writing papers in theory. It's not about talking about things and just talking and talking and talking and based our talking on other talks and other talks. Imagine what the references culture do. What does the academic tradition do? When you're focusing on, if your goal, for example, is, let's say, if there are colleagues here who are at Purdue. So, for example, one of the things that these, writing research sort of people who work in academic genres and academic writing will keep telling you and telling research the students, you must have reference citations, cite, most recent citations, make sure the citations come from X or Y sources, and they're respectful sources, and of course all that creates hierarchies of knowledge and all these boundaries. But notice how it sort of continues, creates these how the writing and centers sort of take us into literacies and base everything on referencing. And if you look at those references, guess what? Those references are based on other references, and you go back, they're based on other references. And notice everything in the field is based on not references and references and references. And many of those references are based on surveys and all sorts of things. But very infrequently, it's very rare that you will find things that are based on actual observation. An observation and an analysis of the observation or a set of actions. That's very rare in the literature. And that's a problem. Why? Because if we don't have models of action, if we don't have models of good practices, then how do we create good practices? So that's why in our education, we also want to engage our students to look for good examples, good models, get them to do things, make things. So they learn to do, they learn to act. And by learning to act, they become independent, have developed the ability to take action, instead of becoming dependent on other people, which is unfortunately what our educational systems do at the moment. That's why our educational states, our economic state is in the way it is, because our economies are dependent. And in many parts of the world, for example, in Philippines, Bangladesh, Pakistan, take any of these countries, a very large part of our economy is based on remittances, people sending money from abroad. Now, with what's happening with COVID-19, that those incomes are going to decrease. So even things are going to get even worse from what they were, because that income that our countries were dependent on are no longer coming in or in the same proportion. So the economies are going to struggle even more. And notice how our education is not helping our students and our citizens to become independent. Instead, it's taking them more into dependency. So that's where we are breaking it up and trying to move them away using the credible approach. Now, the PDA it's a little form, and it sort of starts off by saying, notice it starts with saying analyzing things, right? I'll just make this a bit bigger. So notice it's a thing. So a thing can be anything. It doesn't have to be a text. And you describe the thing. And then what is the thing? Why is this thing used? What is the goal of the thing? Who created it? Sort of a bit of the background, so get a sense of what that thing is and when, where did you find it? Where was it created? All that stuff. And then, why do you think that this is a successful thing? Why do you think it's a successful example? So thinking about things in terms of why are things good also, sorry. Yeah, why are things good? And then thinking about how is a thing using different sensory systems if it does? So for example, is it using sight? For example, sight can include many things. Text or written language is one example, but it can use other things like visual images, films, other things. Sound is the same thing. You can, yes, use human language, but you can use other kinds of sounds, right? In certain contexts, if you are in the present, you can use a smell, touch, and taste. But in other contexts, you can use references to them. So for example, I can create an artwork where I can put let's say, one of the things I really like, Mona and I love are fuska in Bangladesh. So we make a plate of fuska, and it's very colorful, and we have this nice aroma sort of coming out of it, just like through the images, by like looking at how we create the image. And you can look at it, and especially for me, just thinking of it is making me like want to have some fuska. So you can create that sort of image through using image, or you can write about it, or you can speak about it. So you can use sound or sight as reference points into smell, touch, and taste. Remember why? Because sight and sound is group A. It allows you to move away from here and now, and therefore it allows you to manipulate and work through all the other sensory systems. And that's why education primarily works through sight and sound. And notice how through sight, especially through textbooks, our knowledges are constrained and our literacies are constrained. And through that, our ways of engaging with the world, our knowledge, our ways of making knowledge are all sort of constrained. So through education, all of that is happening at the moment. So therefore, it is also through education that we can create this reform. And this brings me to sort of the last part of what I want to talk about today. And I'll just share another set of screen, and then I will stop and ask, we'll start questions. Is this essay called Colonization 3.0. You can find it online. I won't go through the whole essay. I want to go down towards the end where I focus on two things. One, I talk about why should it start with education. So here I talk about two things. I'll highlight them here. So first is that all members of legislature, judiciary, militia, media go through education. So essentially what I'm saying is everybody in the world who does things tends to go through educational systems. So essentially, if our educational systems are strong and independent, then our graduates will be strong and independent. And in time, that will make our institutions stronger and independent. And that's what we want. And if this work is done with imandari, then violence and conflict will reduce and prosperity will start to take hold. And second, because as educators, we are responsible for caring for the socio-semiotic well-being of our students, both material and socio-semiotic well-being of students. And guess what? If as teachers, we are unaware of the damage that the current practices are doing, because we don't know what we are doing, because we are not aware, because nobody's ever told us, because of the training we are given is managed by the very people who colonized us, right? It's the knowledge that we are reading and consuming was created and is created by the very people who used to colonize us, right? So how do you think and why do you think this knowledge is designed for our benefit? It's designed for their benefit. And that's exactly what's happening. They benefit because we are split and we are broken and we are weak. So therefore, if we as educators realize what's going on and try to fix this problem, then in time, through this, we can again fix ourselves and fix our own educational systems. Through that, we can start to help others. Why? Because, and I'll give a third reason that I haven't listed here, but now that we don't, of course, the days of traveling are gone, but remember those days when we used to fly and you get into the airplane and they give you this warning, right? They give you this, not warning, this sort of a briefing where they tell you that, wear the seatbelt, blah, blah, blah. And then one of the things they tell you is always they tell you, take care of you first before you try to help somebody else. So if you've got a child or an elderly person you are taking care of, yes, of course you have to take care of them, but take care of yourself first. And so again, in terms of education, in terms of the kind of reforms that I'm talking about, the credible approach, applying it, we have to, and the goals that we have in trying to do this work, we can only do it if we do it ourselves. We first apply it in our own context, and we do it in our own as ourselves, in our own classrooms, in our own practice. So that's where we start. That's why we have to start in education, because we are educators, right? So we start from where we can do things and we have an ability to do things, because as educators, we have an ability to act in the context of education, right? We cannot act in other contexts. So it's no point trying to focus on that. So very important for us as educators to do this. Now, in doing this, there are 6 things that I think should be the goals of a decolonizing education. And I will read these and briefly outline these, and then I will end my session, and my talking, and we'll hopefully have some time for question, answer, and discussion. So the first one, it is goal, decolonizing education should not or is not consumed by the goal of spreading universal literacy. I've explained and talked about this already. Literacy is visual. It does not have to be tied to knowledge construction or knowledge or science or education. There are 2 different things, and they don't need to be linked to each other. And literacy does not need to be an indicator of development or success or ability. It's a bad indicator. And in fact, it leads to discrimination, and it leads to the kind of problems that we see in our world today. Second, that a decolonizing education is not designed to only prepare people to work for others for petty wages, right? It considers the needs of the community and then trains the citizens to learn to address those needs. It values all forms of knowledge and skills, not just ones included in colonial textbooks and not languages. It is designed to make people independent and able to manage their own needs and resources. And it involves all its stakeholders in its development and management. Now, these are the 6 goals that I have in a sense of decolonizing pedagogy. And I think if we work towards these goals, it doesn't matter how you do it, because each one of us will have to do it differently. We're not in the same place. We're not in the same context. We'll have to do it with it differently. But if we are all working towards the same goal, then hopefully we will achieve similar outcomes. And one way in which we can sort of try to maximize the possibility that we will all achieve the same goals is through this last point here, that I will read to you. Ways out of colonization will be led by people who have integrity and an understanding of how symbolic or socio-semiotic systems work, and have the ability to apply these understandings to improve the material and non-material conditions that they find themselves and others in. So all of you can do this. There is no one way in which people will make the reforms and the transitions necessary, nor is there a way to know what the outcomes of such reforms will be. These will depend on context. However, one thing is for sure. If these movements are led with imandari and not ego, not greed, not personal gain, then people and non-humans in the region will be much better off than under the regimes of exploitation and colonization that we experience today. Thank you. With that, I'll stop and take questions.
Evita, thank you very much. Can you hear me, Ahmar? Okay. A wonderful session. We have already crossed 1.5 hours. We received in total 17 questions. I sent the question to your inbox. Can you see the questions, please? Or I can read out. I can, Amar, you need to unmute.
Yes, I can see the questions. In fact, can you send them to everybody,
yes,
so that everybody can see them?
Yeah, I already shared, but
okay.
Just to help you out, Evita will actually can read out some of the questions, so all of you can participate.
Yes, okay, Evita. Sir. Okay, sir. So I'll start with the first question. Is the sound clear? Am I audible?
Yeah.
Okay, so the first question to sir is Western ethics in research applicable for Eastern ethics?
It's a fantastic question. It's something that I actually posted yesterday and a couple of days ago on my Facebook, and I generated a lot of controversy. Let me just see if I can find it quickly, and I will show it to you, because it answers this question. It exactly answers this question. Right. I'm sorry, I'm just looking for it. Okay, I found it. Okay, so let me share my screen again. Okay, on ethics in academia. Now, notice what I'm saying. In addition to reviewing individual research projects for ethics, shouldn't we review entire disciplines or fields of study? For example, when the idea of EMI, for English medium instruction, when the idea of EMI itself is unethical, how can any work that supports EMI be ethical? Now, notice what I'm saying here. What I'm saying is, when we look at questions of ethics, we often get trapped into thinking of ethics as something that has to do with the research project. So you think of it in terms of consent forms, getting permission from your participants, making sure you've got all those things, right things ticked off by your, human subject committee or human, whatever committee that your university might have. Most universities have some sort of human ethics, research ethics committees. So these research ethics committees will review your process and application, and then they will approve it. And they're looking at methodologies and sort of things. Now, what I'm actually saying is the question of ethics actually is not simply about methodologies. Actually, we need to take it a step further and ask ourselves, are certain questions or certain lines of studies ethical in the first place? So, for example, and this is something, EMI is the reason I'm talking about EMI right now is because something that I'm very worried about, and something that I'm working to try to see change is the trend that EMI is being set up and established as a whole independent field of study. You can see departments, various centers of excellence being set up at different institutions, including Oxford, actually led by Oxford, where centers of EMI are being set up. Right, a new journal is being set up, a journal which will be co-edited by some of my friends and colleagues, focusing on EMI, and I'm really worried about it. Because when you legitimize EMI as a field of study, then you're not questioning whether EMI is ethical. You become stuck in whether a study is ethical or not ethical in terms of its approach and methodology. but you're not questioning the ethics of EMI itself. And that's what I'm going to question. EMI is in itself unethical. Why? Because the idea that a language other than your indigenous or local language can be a medium of instruction because is treacherous. Why? Because language is not a medium of instruction. Language construes your knowledge. The categories in English that we learn becomes the categories through which we see the world. And notice our categories in our own indigenous languages are not the same as the categories in English or Western languages. Now, I've used the word categories many times today. Let me just take a minute to explain why this is so important. And I think one of the things we need to understand is why are categories formed and what are categories? Essentially, categories are the building block of any science. Now, science is not about methodology or application. Of course, we apply science to do things. But science, in its basic core sense, is a way of categorizing and classifying the world. Now, notice in Western sciences, there are two main ways in which they create categories, irregardless of the discipline. The first is through genealogy. So, for example, in biology, they look at the species and the hereditary relationship between various species, right? You look at the genealogy of various animals and their histories and their life, their links across development and evolution. Or you can look at languages. You can look at languages in terms of language trees and what languages are sister languages to what and what are, mother languages, and you look at genealogy of languages. Essentially anything you do, you look at genealogies. Genealogy is one of the key ways in which Western knowledge is built. You look at religious studies, you find the same thing. You've got sister religions, right? You've got mother religions, you've got daughter religions, you've got sister religions, which are it's like Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. We see a link, which is a hereditary link, a genealogical link. So that's one way of creating knowledge. Or the other way of creating knowledge in Western traditions is through looking at categories based on structural or functional variations. So think about it in terms of biology. You have categories that are based on functions, things that can swim, things that can fly. Or you can look at structural features. So for example, within birds, some birds have claws that are like this, and other birds have feet which have web between their toes. One is called, one are called passerines and the other are called non-passerines. This is a classification which is based on structure. In language, you have the same things. You have structure-based grammars and you have functional-based grammars. In religious studies, you have the same thing. You have descriptions of culture based on structures or on functions, right? You find the same thing repeated again and again. Across any Western science, any scientific area of study, you go into it and you find the same approaches to categorization. And notice how these approaches are at odds with indigenous ways of knowledge construction. Why? Because indigenous ways of knowledge construction are not fragmented, are not divisive, but rather they're integrative and holistic. So the approaches of knowledge construction, the approaches of creating categories and why categories are created and how categories emerge, is extremely important for us to understand what knowledge is and what language does in relation to knowledge. So the reason that English is the biggest and most scientifically developed language is not because English itself is developed. It's because the people who speak English colonized all of the world. They went to every part of the world. And because their geographical region and their experiences expanded, their categories expanded because their observations expanded. Whereas other languages that were more geographically limited did not develop the same categories because they did not need to. And that explains the differences between different languages and how they're different in relation to developmental things and all these things. But notice here that it is nothing intrinsic about a European language or English. It's in fact, the reason that English is so developed is because it was a colonizing language. That's a bad thing. It's not a good thing. and that there are other ways of creating knowledge, there are other sciences that also coexist.
Okay, sir. Thank you for the very elaborate answer, and I hope that answers the questions. I hope we have time for all our questions because we have another 17 to go.
Yes.
So I'll quickly jump to some of the larger issues. So we have a couple of questions from on subaltern linguistics. So I'll start with the first one. Subaltern linguistics is more about social well-being and very difficult to connect to English research. For example, I'm presently working on learner strategies in ESP context. How can learning strategies be used? Okay, I'm just reading it out as it is. How learning strategies used to learn a foreign language are useful for the social well-being. It may be useful for the apprentice learners, but not much related to the greater community.
Now, that's exactly the problem that I'm addressing and want to raise. Why are we working on learner strategies? Why? Why do we work on that topic? I mean, notice we keep talking about the strategies, and we keep working on motivation, but our work keeps happening. But everybody is doing work on motivation and strategies. But notice in the ground level, the students' motivation is not changing. Nothing's changing. So what's the point of doing this research when nothing is going to change? That's what I'm saying. Stop doing this kind of research. Stop doing research in SLA altogether. There's just no point to it. Do not create knowledge for the sake of creating knowledge. Don't depend on literature reviews and literature gaps to help you identify a project. Create a project based on your community and everything else fits in, right? Sugar campaign. Now, like that as an issue, it's interdisciplinary. You can create reading activities, you can create writing activities, you can create listening activities, you can work across disciplines, you can make them create posters, you can make them create videos, you can make them create different sorts of resources. Again, I won't take too long, but I want to show two more things to you, which I've been hoping to do through question answer session. I want to show you a list of examples that you guys can also use. Yeah. So here is a link to, it's a YouTube channel that I have. It's called Sydney Linguist. And there's a link, I will share this link here with you guys as well. I'll just copy this here and you can all look at it later as well. And this has a bunch of, it has 12 different projects which are examples of things that can be done in a classroom. Notice there's even one called Reduce Sugary Drinks Intake. Now, I would like you to watch it. We can't watch it together today, but this is an example of what students, what teachers can do in a classroom with their students to address this problem. So creating these, taking these real issues and turning them into your curricular goals, into linking them to your syllabus, into making sure that your students have the literacy and the knowledge that will help them live a better and healthier life. That is the goal, right? So look through these examples, especially this one here. I won't watch it with you, but have a watch yourself. It's an example of a project that you can do yourself with your own students, where and through this you can help them reduce intake of sugary drinks. Again, of course, because you are in different contexts, you will have to adapt them and use them in different ways. Now, so these are examples, and I want to share these examples with you because, of course, we don't have time to do this here, but these are examples of what you can actually do in your classroom. So in going back to your question, in fact, the credible approach is designed for a classroom. It is designed for English or language classrooms. You can adapt the credible approach in your classroom, whether it's a language classroom or a science classroom, makes little difference because it's designed to be adapted by teachers and used in a classroom, right? So it is for you to use. The next thing I want to show you here is last thing here is going back to this one, but changing this to part B. So again, this is on my academia page. This is called part B, examples of students' credible projects. You can find it on my academia page, and you will find there's another 14 examples things like from mental health to environmental protection to all sorts of things, healthy eating, reusable bags, different projects that people have done with me, and they go, you go through these. They're written for, you will notice that they're written as in very accessible manner. They're not written to scare people away. We are not using a lot of referencing. We're using images. We're using examples. We're showing what people have done. We're giving you examples of the designs that people have made, why these designs are good. So essentially, we are sharing examples of success stories. Again, we're sharing PDA, examples of positive discourse analysis. Why? Because we want to share examples of ways in which you can use this understanding. Credible is not theoretical. Subaltern linguistics is not theory. I keep saying this and I keep writing that subaltern linguistics is practice. It is practice. It is not theory. It is doing things. It is creating things. It's making things. It is not writing papers, not studying strategies, not studying motivation, not doing those things. It's creating things. And you know what you will realize? This is really interesting. As soon as you get your students into doing things, and soon as you start getting students to make things like designing reusable bags. Notice how cool this design is. So for example, notice here when they design a bag, they're creating the handle linked to the turtle. So by holding the turtle, by handling the bag with the heavy by things inside, you're actually stretching the turtle. You're hurting the turtle by holding the bag. So the idea of the design itself in trying to capture the meaning of environmentalism is something that we worked with and talked about in the classes, in the discussions. And the students developed these designs through our discussions by reading, by doing other PDA analysis. So these are the outcomes of the students' work. And of course, they're also writing, they're also describing, but notice how their writing is much more interesting and engaged. And it is telling us what we can do, right? Creating awareness for sex education. Again, this is something that's very relevant in terms of many parts of the world, and how to deal with it in a sensitive manner, because I know that it's not a topic that we can talk about in all parts of the world. So how do you deal with these things? Again, reusing things. So the very nature of writing also is changing. So notice it's all application based. Okay? So I'm hoping that this answers not just one, but multiple questions in relation to credible approach and subaltern linguistics. And the key point here that credible linguistics, credible approach, subaltern linguistics, decolonizing pedagogy, they are all actions. They're all acts. They are not just about talking.
Evita,
okay, thank you, sir, for the very in-depth answer. Yes, sir.
Evita, question number 17. We can ask the participant to ask the question. We have a couple of minutes to make it a little bit interactive, so participant can actually unmute and ask the question. Question number 17, can you just find out question number 17? Mahbooba Moon, I think. There's a question number 17. You can read out if we can't find Mahbooba Moon.
Yes, sir. Okay. All right. There are a couple of questions here. The first one being, how far would you relate credible criterion to external validity of a research? Should I read all of them at a go? I think I'll do that. Samuel Messick, 1989, who is widely recognized as an expert on validity, defined validity as an integral evaluative judgment of the degree to which empirical evidence and theoretical rationale support the adequacy and appropriateness and inferences and actions based on test scores or other modes of assessment. Do you think there is a strong relationship between the adequacy and appropriateness to the credible criterion of a research? And if so, how research should be more context-driven?
Yeah, notice I don't use terms like reliability and validity, and that is on purpose. Because the idea of validity and reliability are partly statistically based, right? Reliability is a statistical measure, so is validity. Right. So notice these concepts are coming from a statistics and a statistical analysis, and are based in ways of thinking about knowledge and knowledge production, which is based on analysis of numbers and analysis of text and analysis, doing discourse analysis and things like that. It's stuck in methodologies, right? So it's reliability and validity in terms of data, in terms of methodology, in terms of that stuff. Now, in the credible approach, we don't have any of it. We don't have any of that stuff. We just don't have it because we are not doing that stuff. We are not doing that research. We are not collecting data. We are not collecting, doing text analysis. We are not doing any of this stuff. That's not our goal anymore. So if that kind of research is no longer our goal, then we are not concerned by things like reliability and validity. It make no difference. And also notice in writing this question, how the person is using referencing and how a person is using that person who is known as an expert. Now notice how we are using referencing in a way to give credibility to an argument. That is exactly what I was pointing out earlier, that we are so used to building knowledge based on referencing, not on observation. So for example, why are we interested in validity and reliability? Why does it matter who that expert is or not? Is it even an issue that we need to be concerned about, right? So forget about the specifics, talk about the bigger question. Are issues of reliability and validity something that should matter to a project where we are trying to do something and create some things and make some things? Isn't credibility about achieving benefit to your community? If you're benefiting your community, it doesn't matter how you do it, right? If your community is benefiting, it doesn't matter if your work is theoretically sound or not. It doesn't matter if your grammar is correct or not. It doesn't matter whether you are using native speaker grammar or non-native speaker grammar, or if you're writing in broken English or pidgin English. It makes absolutely no difference. If you're getting your work done, you have achieved your goal. One of my favorite examples of this, actually, it comes from Bangladesh, and I'm sure many of you might have already heard about this example. Is I know that in many parts of the world, in Pakistan too, in Bangladesh too, we know that because there's public toilets are not always available, then we know what happens if people pee on the side of the street. And this story about how there was a campaign to try to stop people from peeing on a particular street. There were notices, people put posters, people put banners, people said, not allowed, peeing not allowed. And nothing changed it. Nothing changed it. People kept doing it. Even if you put posters and say there's a fine, people are still doing it. So the human behavior was not being changed. It wasn't changed. They kept doing it. Then somebody came along who was very clever. And they used sociosemiotic thinking. So what they did, instead of creating, punishments and posters stopping people, what they did, they wrote the same things. Do not pee here, but they wrote it in Arabic. Right. Exactly, right? Now, because people could not read Arabic, but they associate Arabic with the Quran, therefore, because of the respect for the Arabic, people stopped peeing there. Notice how human behavior was changed by using language and sociosemiotics. Understanding at how language relates to beings, how people relate to certain things, and applying those understandings to improve and to regulate, in this case, human behavior. In this case, to create a clean environment, getting rid of unhygienic behavior. So these are examples of application. And that's where I think we should be thinking about application, not about validity, not about reliability, because those are irrelevant to us. Our goal is not collecting data. Our goal is not coding data and checking if our data can be collected and recollected and be about reliability or not within our data, because we're not concerned. Why? Because that's not our goal any longer. Our goal is not to do that research. We are stopping to do that research. Why? Because that research does not help us. It doesn't help anybody except perhaps the person who is the author. Why? Because the author might get brownie points. They might get a promotion because of it, or they might get money because of they're published in X paper in a certain journal. And so they have an individual vested interest in publishing. There's no other larger community goal in publishing. The goal of publishing is extremely selfish. And so, of course, nothing good comes out of that act. Why? Because the goal of the niyat, do you guys know the word niyat? Do you use the word niyat in Bangla?
Yes, we are familiar with
the niyat, right? So your niyat, the niyat is what determines the outcomes of your actions. If your niyat is not clean, then your work is not going to lead to anything. And that's unfortunately what happens in current research practices. Our niyat is not clean because we want to publish a paper so we can get a, a raise or a bonus or a promotion. So when our niyat is not clean in our work, in our research, then what are we going to achieve? Of course, not much. So notice with the credible approach, we are changing that because our niyat now is community benefit. Our niyat is no longer publishing a paper for our benefit, but it's doing a project working with our community to improve our community. And that niyat, because our niyat is clean and is a positive, happy niyat, which contributes to your community, the outcomes will be positive. And then, of course, you can publish that material. Publication comes later, right? And that is what I'm suggesting. So stop thinking about projects in the way that you have always thought about it. Stop doing literature review based research. Stop finding gaps in literature. This is very important for my colleagues who are university professors here, but equally important for students and classroom teachers. Get your students to do things actively, doing things that is going to help them and help others. Imagine by creating this anti-sugar projects, if you do nothing else, at least you yourself and the students who are creating these projects and the parents and siblings of these kids, they will learn about sugar. And perhaps that will impact them individually. And if you do that, if those children stop eating sugar now, they will not get to diabetes. Their chances of getting diabetes type 2 will reduce. That is the real impact of education. That is what we want to gain out of what we do, because that will create a healthy and prosperous community.
Okay. Ahmar Mahboob, since today is a Zumba day, I think we'll be taking one more question, Evita.
Yes,
and
sir.
then we need to wrap up and take a group photographs digitally. Evita, the last question, please.
Okay, so I'll merge two questions here very quickly. So the first one is, it's really nice to think and relate literature with practical life. But as you were talking about action, how far do you think it's possible in our context to implement our good thoughts into action inspired by literature? And I'll add one more question here. In a materialistic world, we are all living where the goal of the educational institutions is to prepare our students for the job sector. How can the teachers motivate the learners to value real education?
Okay, our students and us, we know, are engaged and want to improve their communities and improve their lives. That in itself is enough. If you get your students and you tell your students, let's do this so that this is going to clean up our streets, they will be interested because they want their street to be clean, right? So that's already there, which is something that we should work on and build and support. So we want to encourage students to do community embedded things. So that's where actually the motivation comes from. Notice that through these activities, we're not ignoring literacy. Literacy is still part of everything. It's just that we're not making it the goal. So knowledge and literacy are no longer the goal. They're just tools. We're going to use these as tools, as resources for action. So that's the shift. Now, what was that? What was the first question? Can you repeat that again?
Yes, so the first one was regarding how can you relate literature
yes.
with
now, excellent. Yes, I remember now. Thank you. Yes, I remember now. Okay, thank you. So, for example, first of all, notice I'll tell you something. This is my own story. My undergraduate, at Karachi University. And interestingly, I had some very good friends who are from Bangladesh who were my classmates at Karachi University in the English department. When we were in the English, my degree was in English literature. My honors is in English literature. But during my study of English literature, even when I was in college, I was really frustrated. I was frustrated by the fact that we were mostly reading European authors, and then we were reading criticism of those Western authors by other Westerners often. So I didn't see any representation of the self in the literature, so I sort of abandoned it and I moved out of it. But notice, I've just shared 2 points that I've written with you. So literature, I haven't left or abandoned literature, but I don't see a point of reading literature for the sake of reading literature, or critiquing characters, or talking about character building for the sake of character building, or analyzing things from a technical perspective for the sake of that. There's no point to it. I don't see any reason. literature has a very important purpose in life. And a study of literature can contribute very greatly to how we engage with the world around us. In fact, I think one of the best examples of people who use literature that I know of is from Bangladesh, is Professor Fakhrul Alam. Many of you might know him, whose work I really admire, especially in the case where he draws from literature to talk about how various authors or various points in times, humans and humans confronted different issues. So, for example, there was a recent piece where he looked at how through in literature how people at various times have dealt with pandemics, and how how literature responds to pandemic. And through that analysis, he has some very important things and observations that we can learn from. And I think that's the useful kind of literature, where we are using literature to learn about our own life and applications of it in our own context and life, or writing literature to engage with people, and to carry on a thought or a discourse and engage with people. That's where I think is the value of literature. Not necessarily just technical interpretations of literature for the sake of publishing. Again, connecting literature to life, connecting academic work, whether it's in literature or linguistics or TESOL or anything, it doesn't matter, but connecting them to life.
Okay, I think Evita, excellent.
Yes.
One note to all participants: please note that we have shared all the questions to Dr. Ahmar Mahboob. I guess we have a WhatsApp group, and I send the link to everyone. You can be connected, where actually you can get the question and answer session with Ahmar Mahboob. We are already crossed one afternoon, and then there is a Zuma day. So from the organizing team, I especially thank Dr. Ahmar Mahboob for an excellent session, and ever ending, because I can understand that we need more hours to discuss. The questions are really thought-provoking, and we'll share the question with you. And I was just thinking one term that you research in an action. I regretted that I did a research for, I wasted 6 years of my human labor that you talked, because nobody read that. Research is only used for promotion, and of course some international publication. And when after listening to you, I feel like to do something different now. And that is one point for researcher. And second, for our students. I was thinking after COVID, when I'll go back to class, my research student will be asking very different questions to me. No more literature, no more theory, no framework. If I ask them now about framework, I'm sure Didar and other group will be talking about this. So very thought-provoking, and for especially language educators, looking for research from a different perspective, something that we can identify, something that should be contextual, credible. Wonderful. And I've been learning from you so much. And I was listening, I'm getting some notes inbox from some of our participants, whether we can have some more session in future, which we can talk about it actually.